Hello everyone, my name is Hardik and welcome to the fifth episode of For What It's Earth, a talk series that aims to initiate important conversations about the future of our environment. This is a very special episode as we have an inspiring world leader joining us as a guest today, a biodiversity scientist, entrepreneur, environmentalist, and the former president of Mauritius, and the first woman to be elected in her position. We are honored to have today's conversation with the one and only Ameenah Gurib Fakim. Thank you so much, ma'am, for joining with us today. You are a lot of things: scientist, an environment advocate, an entrepreneur, and the former president of Mauritius, and the
Yes,
first woman to be elected in that position. Right?
yes.
Mind blown. So, what has inspired you in your journey?
I think it was the passion for science. That's what drove me since my childhood, since I was as young as you are. And I was just very passionate about the environment around me. And I was very keen to know how nature functions, why the plants are green, why the sky is blue, that kind of thing. And I have never chosen any specific career path. I was just happy doing what I was good at and I was passionate about. And that's what drove me to the sciences in the first place. And when I came back to Mauritius, I have always been passionate about this, and this is what got me going. So again, the moral of the story for young people is just be passionate about what you do. And when your work becomes your passion, you can do wonders.
While drafting policies like governmental policies, what key factors do you take into consideration, especially from the perspective of the environment, right? So, what is your approach when working on a framework?
Well, presidents don't actually work on them policies. They actually just sign off the bills and the law into law. What is important is that whenever policies are being written, especially with respect to environment, and this became very clear since 2015 when we had the COP21 meeting for the climate, we realized that, it's done with the best intentions in mind. All policies are written with the best intention in mind. But where the problem comes in is when it comes to the implementation. And this is where interests come in. And this is what derail very often the processes, because corporate interests and other sort of interests come in and derail the process. And this is what we've seen. In fact, since the climate agreement was signed off in 2015, we saw some of the big players coming out of it later in the past 5 years. So very often, as I said, when policies are written and, all the best interests are there, but they get derailed for things which are beyond the control of people who have written the bill and the law.
I do agree. It can be sometimes difficult to implement policies. So, according to you, given the rising urgency of the situation, what policies or actions must different governments take to tackle climate change?
Um, there are lots of conversation going around the world as to what must be done. Individually, I think people are very concerned. I think people like yourself, people like myself, we are very concerned about the legacy we leave for the next generations, my children, my grandchildren, hopefully one day. So at individual level, we're prepared to make a few sacrifices. But again, where the problem lies is at international level. At international level, where the big players, because there are no two ways about solving a climate change crisis. You have to reduce emission. And to reduce emission, of course, this where, if you bring it down to the country level, if we bring it down to the institutions, this is where the problem lies. Because again, the interests come in and they prevent the necessary decision which need to be taken to tackle climate change. And we have seen a lot of movement across the world. I mean, one which has been driven by Greta Thunberg, for example, where she says, she's been very categorical about it. And she's right to say that the way to tackle climate change is that the big players must come around the table and the big players must take bold decisions. But these big players, they also need to be elected. And this is where the problem lies, because very often the decision they will take will impact maybe or maybe not the chances of getting elected further down the line. So this is what tends to derail very often the implementation of these policies.
How can government bodies and civil bodies like NGOs, activists strengthen ties to maximum the positive impact on the environment?
One thing that the average citizen has not realized so far is that power is in their hands. Right? What we're seeing right now, especially in countries like the United States, we have seen that the movement of people can make a difference. And this is where I think the grassroots has a very important role to play to sustain the pressure to make people realize that, we cannot afford to have this past normal before COVID, because right now we're talking about the post-COVID era. So before the COVID era, there was a problem with that normal. And that normal must not be reproduced again as we open up. So what are the decisions we're going to take that we don't destroy our biodiversity? Because increasingly they're pointing to wild animals being sold in the wet market, where the source of the problem started. But what brought this state of affairs to happen? So how do you protect the biodiversity? How do you limit the greed? And how do you limit, for example, because we have seen that some of the forests are being destroyed because they are being replaced by cash crop. This is where there is an interlink between the policies, the implementation, what happens on the ground. And one thing we have also seen, how interconnected we are. So what happens in India, what happens in Dubai, what happens in the United States will impact the rest of the world equally, and of course with varying impact depending on the leadership that country has. So this is again where we have to bring the focus that the power lies with the people, and we have the capacity to make change. And if you want to make positive changes, we should be able to do that as well.
What are some of your major concerns regarding the environment today?
Yesterday we celebrated the Ocean Day, and it was the International Ocean Day yesterday, the 8th of June. And I think we are all very concerned at the global level on the impact of plastic pollution. We increasingly talk about the dead zone in the oceans. And we talk about the pollution which is happening in the seas, which are beyond national jurisdiction. And you know that nearly 70% of our ocean space is outside a jurisdiction of countries. So who looks after that? And how do we limit pollution there? And how do we limit the warming of the oceans? I mean, all these again are interlinked to what policies we put in place. So to me, there are two main issues with plastic pollution. There is not just the macroplastic, there's also the microplastics. And finally, all these plastics in the environment will go back into our food cycle. They will end up in the fish that we eat. So whatever goes round comes round, and I think it's high time we start looking at the circular economy so that we can really properly recycle everything that we consume. And also by developing a circular economy, we are going to be promoting in the creation of jobs. And that's very important for young people like yourself.
What role can the youth play in all of this? How can they drive the mentality that the environment is important and they're more conscious of it?
Well, I think it's all in your hands, the young people, because you're going to inherit the earth that we would have left to you. Unfortunately, as I've said yesterday when I gave the speech on Ocean Day, is that we haven't still realized that we did not inherit the earth from our parents. We borrowed it from our grandchildren. So this, I think you are the future. And I think a lot of the decision and a lot of the mobilization must come from your generation. and make push up so that the decisions are influenced, the right decisions are taken by older people like myself, so that we leave you something which is worthwhile and which is sustainable. So you should be maintaining your advocacy, you should be maintaining the grassroots movement, and also you should be doing the necessary actions as well, because parents are very often educated by their kids. So you have the capacity to make change.
The UN has declared this decade as the decade of action. They want to achieve a lot for the environment by 2030. But if we look back till the decade of 2020, most of what they had set targets as weren't achieved. And they are saying now that they want to drive more action. But it seems a little difficult for some reason when we look at the targets not being achieved. So what is the approach you think intergovernmental organizations like UN that connect all of us in some way should have in the policies they put in place and the kind of action they take?
When the UN approved the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015, so that deliverables are there, and also countries will be asked to actually report on the progress on the Sustainable Development Goals. The slogan that was used is to leave no one behind, right? And if you look at the systems of each SDG, they're all systems by themselves. And I think if we deliver on the 17 SDGs, we're going to have a very prosperous world. But already we are starting with a very big setback now with the COVID, and we have seen some of the gains that we made a few years back. But right now, I think we are seeing a lot of challenges ahead of us. We've seen the COVID, we have seen the impact of climate change, and we have seen that there is not that will really to address climate change, because as I said earlier on, the issue is that it is far too linked with interest. Interest by many big sectors, many polluting sectors, and also interest by politicians who are driving their own political agenda to get re-elected. So the vision is 5 years, whereas we're talking about climate, we're talking about all these, the visions are much longer. And only a few countries in the world have adopted this vision, but the big players have to also deliver on the promises they've made to the people. And so this is what we need to do. We need actions, but we need actions from the big players more than the small players. Although climate agreement in Paris were won precisely because everybody agreed to come together through the NDCs. And so we just have to keep on putting pressure on governments to keep on working in the interest of the environment, because there is no planet B. We only have one planet. And unfortunately, because the interests are there, the vision is short term, we haven't really we haven't really interiorized the fact that our future is linked to the health of our planet. So this is something that has to be brought in, and has to be brought in by people like yourself.
So one thing that has been coming around, because now countries are recovering from COVID, they're talking about green recovery, where they're talking about coming back, but in a more sustainable and in a more in a way that's more friendly for the environment. So as someone who is a world leader and who has been there in terms of understanding the functioning of a nation and the economy, what role do businesses and governments need to play in ensuring a green recovery? And is green recovery possible? Because many countries, environment isn't really their first concern. They have concerns like they're a conflict zone, they have poverty, they have hunger issues. They have so many levels of issues. So what do countries like that do in such a case?
We're talking about green recovery, but I think, do we really understand what green recovery means? Now, if we look at before the spread of COVID, what actually made the spread of COVID easy? Well, we all pointing out to that animal, the way we have destroyed the forest, the animal have come close to human, and we have seen the changes in the protein coat on the COVID virus, which made it easily transferred from animals to humans. So the conditions are there for this kind of transmission. Now, to answer the question, the first thing we have to ask ourselves, to what extent do we stop the destruction of the forest? Do we have the necessary will? Are people prepared to change their habits? Because a lot of it is down to food habits, for example. So first thing that we have to accept is the necessity for change. Are we prepared at individual level to make the change? So that's the one thing that we have to reconcile with. The second, of course, is interest. Because why do we destroy the forest? We destroy the forest for many reasons. We destroy the forest to harvest the wood, for example, because it's a thriving logging industry. There is a necessity to go back to the land to grow crops, as I said earlier on, a cash crop, which destroy the ecosystem in these forests. And there is also a lot of illegal activities, illegal logging, illegal human trafficking, all that you can think of are happening within that little sphere of development. So the first thing that we have to ask ourselves, how prepared are we to effect change at individual level, at country level? And do we have the strong leadership to ensure that, when they sit around the table, they are prepared to make sacrifices? And, unfortunately, I don't see that happening anywhere in the world. So this is where I think the movement of the young people, you have to make your voices heard, that this is where you want to go. And how do you do that? You do that through your social media account. You do that through your wallet. You do that through your voting. And you have to be prepared to make the changes this way. So people who do not listen to what you're trying to do, people who are not prepared to listen to your voice, then, there's a price to pay. But unfortunately, again, not being cynical, I don't see that happening. And very often people who actually advocate for these changes, we've seen that in the Amazon forest, they get killed because they're disturbing certain interests. So this is where the movement, and we are living very interesting time. I think right now, in what's happening in the United States, we're witnessing a civil rights movement which is emerging, because people are saying enough is enough. We don't want that. This is not what should define us. So what define you? What define your ideals? And what resonate with you? And this is the kind of movement that you have to bring, because change will happen when people are willing to make that change. And that change comes from young people.
We see a lot of world leaders who do not want to accept climate change, or are definitely not willing to give it the priority that it needs. How do you get people like them on board? How do you tell them that, listen, environment is something that's connected with everything that's happening around us and it needs to be prioritized? So that would be my first question. And second, a lot of us, even like, I think, especially I have phases, and I'm sure Hardik has too, where we feel a sense of hopelessness sometimes when we don't see change happening, because environment is something you need to work for a period of time. It takes time to see change, but a lot of the youth feel hopeless sometimes, and we just want to give up sometimes. So how do we come over that hopelessness of that, things will change?
For the past 3 months, the world has stopped. And when the world has stopped, I think even India, you've had the benefit of seeing blue skies. In regions of Nepal, you actually saw the Himalayas. In Venice, in Paris, in many other big cities, you've seen nature coming back in again. And we have seen, I think, the average figure, we have seen a drop in greenhouse gas emission for this year, at least for the past few months, down by 7%. So I think nature is telling us something very, very important, right? Nature is telling us that if you're not careful, and I say we as a species, we as a human race, we are ejectable from this planet. I think this is the message that is coming out from nature to us. We have to view it that way. And I don't know, and I would like to be wrong, that whatever we're going to open up to next month or the next few months will not be the same as it has been before, because our survival is at risk on this planet. And the messaging, I think, is very, very simple. And you have seen how nature regenerates so easily when humans stop interfering. So they're telling us that we are also part of this chain of species who exist here. We are all interconnected with our planet, with our environment. So we have to start doing things right. or else we are not going to the end of such pandemics. And I think, unfortunately, I have been quite pessimistic about this. We are going to see more pandemics coming up because of our lifestyle, the way we have been treating nature, the way we have insulted nature, right? So it will come back to haunt us. And when the ice caps of the Himalayas start melting, when the waters start running down Bangladesh and Pakistan, because the two main rivers, except for the Brahmaputra, which are of course right in the center, we have the Indus and the Ganges. When they start running down the Indian Ocean, the water will rise. And countries like my own, where the water is already going up because we're seeing already erosion. So our future is at stake. So what do? Do we sit back and maintain the same pre-COVID normal? I don't think we can afford to. So I think these are events that will drive the change that we are hoping to see. And as the Mahatma has said, we have to be the change we want to see in the world. So we have to change our own way of doing things. So I think, to answer your question very shortly, we are going to be the products of the changes we bring. And this is why I have hope in people of your generation, because you are going to be the ones who will be driving this change, because you cannot afford to inherit the planet as we want to leave it to you. That's unacceptable.
Do you think that countries of the world actually learned something from the lockdown?
I will answer your question by being a bit provocative. In the lockdown, over the past 3 months, we have seen two kinds of leadership emerging. The strongman leadership, which has been a disaster. We have seen more deaths. We have seen total lack of preparedness. And we have seen another form of leadership which has emerged, and that's female leadership. So the question we have to ask ourselves, are we still prepared to ignore 52% of our world population? The leadership that women bring. So this is the kind of thing that we have lessons we have taken from the past few months. But there is something else which has been revealed. The state of preparedness of our institution. What is the state of preparedness of our health system? What is the state of preparedness of the savviness of the youth to use technology? What is the investment which has been made in our education space? What is the investment which has been made to actually make us much more receptive and much more reactive to these challenges? So I think that COVID has done us a big favor. It has revealed the state of preparedness or the state of unpreparedness of many of our institutions. So I think we can build on these gaps so that when the next pandemic comes up or the next big tsunami or whatever comes up, we are going to show resilience through the preparedness through our institutions. So this is what I think what the lessons we can draw from the COVID, both in terms of preparedness of our human capital and resilience of our institutions.
What is your vision and hope for the environment?
Well, I think my vision, and I think the vision of most of us, there's a sense of urgency. There's a sense of urgency so as not to overheat the planet, because the scenarios have all been worked out by institution, the IPCC, in terms of the greenhouse gas emission. If we go beyond a certain level, what the scenarios are like. We are already witnessing increase in temperatures, so the projection doesn't look very good. So I think what we have to do is to ensure that we make our contribution and we convince the leaders to actually act appropriately. So that's what we have to do.
It's been very, very inspiring. And as youth, we constantly want to be learning, want to be knowing what we can do, what kind of change we can bring. And like I say, there is so much that we need to still learn, but that doesn't mean we need to stop ourselves. So this has been very personally enriching for me and Harzik. And I am sure everyone who watches this will have so much to learn and take away from this. So thank you.
Show solidarity among the young people, right?
Yes.
Listen to each other, listen to your peers. And we will not live long enough to make mistakes and learn, from our mistakes. So we have to learn from others. So just, develop that kind of mindset and be prepared to change yourself, because that will be the best way to safeguard our own future on this planet.